Good morning, everyone, and a special good morning to you, President de la Madrid. For the matter of historical record, we're early April 1996, and it's an unseasonably cool morning, but we offer a very warm welcome to our visitor, President de la Madrid. The Living History program at Duke is honored to be able to have an interview with Miguel de la Madrid, who was President of Mexico from 1982 to 1988. The panelists who will be interviewing President de la Madrid in this conversation are, to my right, Frederick, Associate Professor at the Public Policy Studies Institute here at Duke University, and to Professor Mayer's right, Scott Littlehale, who is a Ph.D. candidate in the Political Science Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also a visiting professor in the North American Studies program here at Duke. Fortunately, and your chair, I'm Gary Gereffi, and I'm a professor in the sociology department here at Duke. Fortunately, this is not President de la Madrid's first visit to Duke, and we certainly hope it won't be your last. We look forward to having you back on many occasions. For purposes of our audience, President de la Madrid, I think it might be useful if you could perhaps provide a bit of a summary of your career trajectory since you have a long and distinguished career in both political and academic circles, including your position since leaving office as head of one of the most distinguished publishing houses in Latin America, Fondo de Cultura Económica. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of a review of some of the major positions in public office you held up to assuming the presidency of Mexico.
Yes, of course, with pleasure. Thank you for your interest in inviting me to this program of Living History at Duke. I have devoted my whole professional career to the public service. Even when I was studying law at Mexico City at the National University, I worked for the legal department of the National Bank of Foreign Trade. And I think that this experience marked me in my vocation, that is combining my profession of lawyer and the economic matters. Well, then I spent 3 years working for a private institution, the mining chamber, an institution who associates mining industries for representing their interests before government, to make studies from a general point of view, and to promote the interests of the mining industry in Mexico. After that, I entered into the Banco de Mexico, that it is the central bank in my country, and I spent there 5 years. And I got a scholarship for studying public administration at Harvard University, and I spent there 1 year. Well, at the same time I was working for the Banco de Mexico or the mining chamber. I was a part-time professor in the law school at the National University, teaching constitutional law and comparative law. Well, I devoted more or less a couple of hours daily to this occupation, and I enjoyed very much this experience. And this was how I combined my professional training in economics, in finance, with this systematic study of the institutions of my country, mainly the political institutions. After coming back from Harvard University, I entered into the Ministry of the Treasury, and I spent there many years. I began to work for the Treasury in 1965. I remained there 5 years as Deputy Director of Public Credit. And then I was moved to the post of Financial Managing Director of Pemex, the oil industry in Mexico. I was there only a couple of years, and I came back to the Ministry of the Treasury when was appointed General Director of Credit. I was promoted to the Undersecretariat of the Treasury for 3 years, and then I was appointed Secretary of Planning and Budget. I work in this character for 3 years, and then I was selected by my party as a presidential candidate at the end of the year 1981, and then the presidency of Mexico from 82, the end of 82 to 88. So this was my professional career, combining politics, economics, public administration.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to ask if you could give us one additional kind of historical perspective along with the personal history you gave us. When you assumed the presidency in 1982, it seemed as though, especially in retrospect, Mexico was at a historic turning point in its development path. Some people now talk about that transition as a transition from an inward-oriented or more closed economy to a more outward-oriented or export-oriented economy. Could you give us a little sense of the kind of development policies in Mexico that led up to your presidency and the sort of situation that you were inheriting when you moved into the presidency in 1982 in terms of Mexico's recent development policies or prior development policies?
Well, yes, Mexico followed for many years the strategy, the prevalent strategy followed by most of the Latin American countries, that is the import substitution policy in order to develop the industrial sector. At that time, the prevalent ideas in this respect were that in order to develop a country was strictly necessary to encourage the industrial sector, transforming of our economies from being basically raw material producers, mainly agriculture, mining, fishing, to the secondary sector, the transformation of these raw materials into manufactured products. This was the general recommendation of the economists at that time. I am talking on the years 1930, more or less. And this trend was reinforced very much by the Second World War, when there was a great scarcity of manufactured products. And then the Latin American countries took advantage of this situation and encouraged industrialization. Well, I think that the case of Latin America was no so different from other countries of the world. Import substitution was in many countries like yours here in the US a strategy for developing the country. Well, this strategy I think was positive, was useful for us, but probably we prolonged excessively this strategy. And by means of the import substitution policy, we protected excessively our productive plants by means of high tariffs, subsidies, low rate credits, and so on. There were excesses. Whenever an industrialist wanted to produce something, he went to the government and obtained the closing of the border in order to protect domestic production. And this domestic production was not always of good quality or at good prices. And evidently there were abuses at the cost or at the expense of the consumer. But as import substitution proceeded, protection to some lines of production implied a penalty not only for consumers but for other industries, because well, industries consume products from each other, and in this respect, well, our competitive position in the world economy deteriorated, and paradoxically, the Mexican economy became very dependent from imports, because we had to import machinery, spare parts, industrial elements to produce, and we incur in a structural deficit of the current account in our balance of payments. So this was the story, and I would add that following also the prevalent economic thoughts at that time in developing countries and also in industrialized countries, the government had played a very important role in conducting the economy, in intervening in the economic life through different ways and means, not only through regulation, not only through fiscal policy, that is taxes and expenditures, monetary policy, but in a direct way. The government was the owner and the direct operator of many industries. Well, probably because at that time there were not many entrepreneurs, and the government had to supplement the lack of enough entrepreneurs. And on the other hand, because some sectors were considered strategic, like oil, electricity, railroads, steel, petrochemicals, and so on, in order to promote the rest of the economy, besides the natural tasks of a government of building infrastructure, communications, generally speaking, roads, airports, ports, and so on. So the Mexican government, the federal government, took very important parts of the economy under its ownership and direct management. And this implied for the government a growing financial deficit. And the big financial deficit caused troubles to the economy, mainly inflation and lack of credit to the private sector. So this was the trend from the 1930s on. As I said, I think that these strategies were justified at the beginning. They helped to foster economic growth, to encourage industrialization. Mexico was able to grow in a very stable way and with high rates of growth. At that time, from the 30s to the 60s, Mexico grew at a real rate of 6 or 7% per year. And taking into account that the population growth was at that time at the very high rate of 3.5. Even with this demographic explosion, the general standards of living of Mexico grew very much. The problem was the prolongation, the excessive duration of these policies. And this was why at some time this strategy was evidently obsolete, and we had to change it. And this was my challenge.
Well, that's a good segue to the next thing that we wanted to focus on with you, which is to take you to the beginning of your term as president and to the context that you inherited, which you've described in general terms. and to ask you about the nature of the challenges you saw it at that time, and about the strategy that you had for changing course on all the dimensions you've just mentioned, the privatization, issues of state ownership, issues of trade and openness to the international economy, and the others that you've touched on. As you came into power in December of 1982, how did you view your circumstance? What did you think you needed to do first, and what was your general strategy for your administration?
Well, at the end of '82, Mexico was facing a very serious economic crisis. The Mexican government had suspended the service of our external debt, not because of a question of principle, but because we didn't have foreign exchange. The oil prices had fell down substantially, and as a result, the external credit of Mexico was also suspended. And Mexico, during the previous 12 years, had occurred to external borrowing in big quantities. First, in order to accelerate the rate of growth, but after, for exploiting the very important oil deposits that were discovered at that time. And in order to extract the oil, we need a lot of money. And we got the money from international markets. But money came to Mexico because of the oil expectatives, because oil was at that time in a line of increasing prices in the international markets. And everybody thought at that time that this was a structural trend, and that oil prices were going to continue climbing because the this imbalance between demand and supply, and because of the control the OPEC, the producers country of the Middle East, had at that time overproduction and exports. And this was the idea of not only of the oil exporters, but also from the importers, and the specialized magazines and the oil economists thought that. And but they didn't realize opportunely that the consumers would react by means of cutting consumption through different means, mainly through technological innovation in transport, in the industry, and with some discipline that the industrialized countries impose over consumers. And on the other side, production augmented in big proportions because of the attraction of high prices. So the situation changed dramatically, and the oil prices began to decline, well, since the beginning or the middle of the year 1981. And then Mexico, as every exporter country, began to enter into serious problems. By the year 82, Mexico had to adjust foreign exchange, and Mexico began to impose a very strict adjustment program, the classical one, rising taxes, reducing public expenditure, limiting credit, and so on. But the inertia at that time was so strong that all these measures were insufficient. And in addition to the devaluation occurred in February 1982, additional devaluations took place over the year. My election was in the middle of this mess. Was in July, and immediately after, in August, there was another big crisis, and the government felt the obligation of nationalizing commercial banks. Well, the outgoing government didn't consult me this measure, probably because they thought that I would have said no.
And would you have?
No, of course, I thought at the time that was a mistake, because the philosophy of nationalizing banks was to gain control over the financial institutions, and by means of that controlling the flux of capital resources abroad. Well, I think that this is not the proper way to do it. Instead, nationalization of the commercial banking system accelerated the outflow of capital, and the banking system didn't catch any American dollar or any other foreign currency after this measure. Well, the foreign debt service was suspended, and all this caused tremendous effects in the real economy. Imports were drastically suspended, affecting not only consumption but production, due to the dependency of our industrial sector. So I began my government in December under these circumstances, without any foreign exchange in the international reserves of the Bank of Mexico, without any dollar, not only to pay foreign debt, but to imports, or to give foreign exchange to our tourists, or well, the daily needs of foreign exchange that every country has. I adopted a very drastic adjustment program. I negotiated with the International Monetary Fund in order to draw lines of credit within the ordinary mechanism of these funds, and gradually we were able to regain some kind of normality. Was a short-term program, but at the same time we thought that besides short-term measures, some structural changes were needed, a change in the strategy. And there were 2 points changing the strategy for development. Well, first, opening the economy, reducing tariffs, recognizing the reality of the foreign exchange rates, dismantling the system of direct controls over imports and exports, prior licenses that covered at that time almost 100% of imports. And well, later on we reinitiate negotiations with GATT to enter in this international body, who is the body in charge of multilateral negotiations in the matter of trade. Till then, Mexico had rejected being member of GATT because of our import substitution policy, and the previous Mexican governments didn't want to assume obligations of dismantling the system of limitations and controls in our foreign trade. So we reinitiate negotiations with GATT in 1985, and we finished negotiations at the end of '86, and we became full members of GATT at that time. Simultaneously, we acted reducing barriers, dismantling licenses and other kind of controls, and maintaining a policy of a realistic foreign exchange rate, with good results, because the Mexican economy increased their capacity to export other things in addition to crude oil. In '82, for instance, crude oil exports represented 70% of our total exports. By the end of my government in '88, these oil exports represented only 30%, and the other portion, the other The remaining 70% were other kind of exports, including manufactured goods. So the Mexican economy reacted very well because of this new strategy. Until now, this is the situation. Most of our exports now are manufactured goods, and oil exports represent no more than 15% of total exports. We are not so dependent from oil.
Just on that point, you said there was two prongs to the strategy when you entered. One was opening the economy,
yes.
and the second was reducing the dependence.
The second was the reduction of the size of the public sector. As I said, because of our development strategy, the size of the public sector had grew very much. The government embarked in a series of very important investments in strategic sectors, oil, electricity, nuclear power, steel, petrochemicals, and so on. But besides, the government decided to promote directly other activities. And the government adopted the policy of protecting employment, even in the case of private enterprises that were failing because of mismanagement or bad technology from the private businessmen. So the goal of employment prevailed, and the government became owner of these plans. And these plans were not always viable from a technological standpoint or other factors. And the government increased consistently the size of the public sector. By the end of '82, the list of public entities of all kinds operating in different lines of production, of activities, of different sizes, of course, was a list of 1,150. And finances in public enterprises were in a very bad shape. And the public deficit in a great proportion was the result of this excessive expansion of the public sector. So we decided to reduce the size of the public sector in order to reduce the public deficit. The public deficit at that time in '82 represented 17% of the GNP, when the normal deficit in Mexico in a period of stability was no more than 3%. Well, we had to act reducing this part of the public sector. In addition, we reduced many offices in central government. We suppressed many offices in the executive departments, posts of undersecretaries, director general, and so on. But the main task was to reduce the size of the public sector. And during my administration, from 82 to 88, we reduced this list of 1,150 to 500. So approximately 700 entities that were liquidated, merged, transferred to local governments, or sold to the private sector. And this line of action was followed by President Salinas, my successor, and now the public sector in Mexico is composed by no more than 200 enterprises. I think that Mexico has been the country who more quickly reduced the size of the public sector, with different results, of course. In some cases, we have succeeded. In other cases, there are failures.
If I might ask on this, I would ask, you had not only a project of economic opening and of shrinking of the public sector, there was also, in order to deal with the issues of a fiscal deficit and the issues of inflation, an concentrated effort to bring about wage restraint among the labor sector, and as well a fairly dramatic reduction of government expenditures on social programs and as well as in education. And I was going to ask you, at the beginning of your term and throughout your term, did you anticipate that these policies would put at risk the historic alliances that bonded certain social sectors, including organized labor and elements of the rural working class, to the PRI and to the state, and what experiences you brought, what roadmap you brought with you to the presidency that provided you with a strategy to address the potential risk of destabilization of those alliances? Or did you have to not have a preset strategy, but rather deal with it as you went along, a learning process as you went along in your presidency?
Well, this exercise of imposing a very strict economic discipline, of strengthening the position of public finances through these means was unavoidable. In fact, there was no option at all. So if we would continue with the trend we had been following, the situation would become unmanageable. So conceptually was not difficult to decide, because there were no options. You have problems to decide when there are many options, or at least two. But when you see the reality and you are convinced that you have to stop the crisis, the deficits, and to reestablish some kind of stability, well, you have to act, because in other way you worsened the situation. this is a question of survival. This is not a question of choosing a model or a new policy. It's a question of survival. Of course, the risk of social instability was great, but I was convinced that if we didn't, if we wouldn't act in such a way, the risk would be much greater than that it was. And the question was to convince my people that there was no other option. And well, we devote all my time to dialogue with the different organizations and the different people, the leaders of the trade unions, the leader of the peasants, the leaders of the entrepreneurs, the leaders of my party, in order to explain very clearly what was the situation.
Let me follow up on something that I think relates to this, which is more specifically on your strategy for opening the economy. As you alluded to, there was a prior attempt or a feeler, at least, to the possibility of joining the GATT in the previous administration. And then it was not, and that was abandoned. And then it was not until the third year, I believe, of your term, or at least 1985, that Mexico began negotiations to enter into the GATT. So I guess the question is why that particular timing? Why not immediately, for example, upon taking office, enter into the GATT? And to what extent was the timing and the process for joining GATT a reflection of a concern about the domestic political implications of this?
Well, first, you have to consider that in '83, we didn't have dollars in our international reserve. And without foreign currency, we couldn't afford liberalizing imports because we didn't have money to pay them. The central bank asked me to limit the permits to import to some monthly quantity, while the international reserves were rebuilt. So there was a very pragmatic question. We didn't liberalize imports because we didn't have any dollar in the in the hands of the central bank. So gradually we were rebuilding international reserves during '83. At the same time, we began to prepare the dismantling of direct controls over imports, over exports. We began to restructure tariffs, preparing the opening. So we began really the opening in '83, but with preparatory measures. And when we felt more equipped to begin the real opening was in 85. Besides, in 85, a new important drop in oil prices occurred. So the situation pushed us to accelerate the opening.
And in terms of just the politics, I mean, as you got to actually adopt the GATT policy, accession policy in 1985, it seemed like there's sort of expected reactions from different groups in Mexico, and in particular, especially in retrospect, some of the firms ended up saying that perhaps Mexico moved into an open economy too quickly, and that the imports that began to come in as a result of the liberalization measures that were started in your administration and continued throughout the succeeding administration created major problems for the economy to adjust. Were there any ways that this adjustment could have been an easier adjustment, or was this just a necessary condition given this position of the Mexican economy at the time you entered the GATT in 1985 and pursued these kinds of measures?
At that time, we thought that we had to accelerate the opening of the economy because we needed to open foreign markets to our exports, and we succeeded. During my administration, the current account was in superávit, and we were able to rebuild international reserves. So the growth of exports were more important than the growth of imports.
Yes.
This happened at that time.
Mm-hmm. And were there many differences among the big firms in Mexico in terms of the degree to which they supported this policy, or in fact that they were able to take advantage of these export openings? Were some of the companies, in retrospect, more successful than others in terms of making that shift by industrial sector, or did it have to do with the leadership of individual firms rather than an industrial sort of difference?
Discussions were not easy, you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But on the average, we were advancing, forming a positive consensus.
And those kinds of discussions were increasingly carried out, would you say, in public forums after you had initial private discussions, or did most of these things have to be done sort of on an individual sector by sector basis?
In any possible form. Negotiations were permanent.
I was curious, and on the other prong of your strategy, to try to get you to draw you out a bit on that as well, the reduction of the size of the public sector. You went cut by more than half the number of state-owned businesses, but there were some that you didn't touch in your administration. Obviously, you made choices about where to cut and which ones to privatize or merge or liquidate and which ones not to. Among those that were not touched were the banks, which had been nationalized just before you came to office. So the question is, how did you decide which ones to do, and why not the banks in your administration?
Well, in the case of the banks, the reason was predominantly of a political nature. The nationalization of commercial banks was approved by Congress from September to November of '82. this Congress was elected simultaneously with me. But because of the political calendar, they took office on the 1st of September, while I took office on the 1st of December. But we were elected simultaneously. And this was a Congress with whom I would govern at least for 3 years, jointly the Chamber of Deputies and the Chamber of Senators. So politically, I consider that it wouldn't be very polite from my part, telling them, well, my friends, you committed a great mistake by approving nationalization of the banks. So please revert your decision. Politically, wouldn't be easy. So I prefer to accept the fact and to manage the new situation. This was the factor I took into account to not trying to reprivatize the banks during my administration.
Was there an opportunity? The Congress serves for 3 years, and then there's
The senators are elected for 6 years.
I see.
And the deputies for 3.
So I was wondering if there was an opening, an opportunity at the end of 3 years to revisit that decision, or whether you felt
because the senators were there.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to return to an earlier theme in that you had discussed, President de la Madrid, the holding of dialogue with various elements of the social sectors, including the trade unions. In 1983, you had said that as president, I pledge that the national interest is above all other considerations, and my position will not be affected by old styles of negotiation. And you had stated in the course of this interview that there was but one alternative for the government. In 1985, the CTM offered to the Labor Congress a alternative development strategy, which was very much different from your strategy. Given that considerable distance between the program that they offered that was at variance with your own program, how difficult was it in 1987, and how important was it, if it was at all important, to reach a pact for economic stability and solidarity, the December 1987 pact, to attempt to bring about new stability? Was it economically important, and how was the process of negotiation involved in establishing that pact divergent or a departure from the traditional styles of negotiation that went on between labor and the state previously?
Well, by the end of '87, they were already a set of prerequisites that we didn't have before. The general climate of understanding between government and businessmen, between government and trade unions, were quite different in relation with the previous years. So we advanced gradually in gaining confidence from society. At that time, we had a strong position in international reserves, while at the beginning we didn't have international reserves at all. At the end of '87, we had an important restructuring of foreign debt, and we were occurring again to the international financial markets. So this is why we were able to arrive to the pact in December '87. So the different sectors had more confidence in the government than before.
What tools were most useful to you in gaining confidence from society, and given that real wages had declined very significantly between between early 1980 and 1987, there was a significant wage decline. What was available to you to try to offset that very real decline in wages to restore and to build confidence amongst the labor-encompassing sectors?
Well, the trade-off was to maintain employment. I was very frank with the trade unions, and I warned them that if they insisted in more salaries, in more real salaries, unemployment would have grew. And they accepted reduction of salaries if we were able to maintain the level of occupation. And we accomplished this goal during those years. Real wages decreased, but we protected the productive plants and employment. During my administration, the matricula of the Social Security system grew consistently every year, not at a very high rates, of course, but was a growth in the Social Security system that is the index of formal employment.
Can I ask
I'm sorry.
I just had a question related to jobs and exports, because you mentioned earlier that one of the successes of your policies was to give rise to non-traditional and especially manufactured exports. But when you trace the export trend in Mexico throughout the late 80s and the 90s, exports continue to increase, but many of them seem to be exports from the maquiladora sector, the sort of labor-intensive assembly operations in Mexico. And I think in Mexico that's always been a very controversial situation, because the maquiladora firms are considered tied to the U.S. economy in some way. I guess two questions. One, do you see the maquiladora exports as being an important part of Mexico's economy through this period and up to the present day? And how can Mexico begin to make the transition towards more integrated forms of export, manufacturing for export, where you have the backward linkages you were talking about earlier in the discussion?
Well, I think the maquiladora plants have been very important during those years to um, to generate employment in the northern border of Mexico. I accept that besides the impact of wages, there have been not integration of other inputs from the Mexican economy, and I think this is one of the challenges we are still facing. Find ways to incorporate to the maquiladora plans Mexican elements besides manpower, just manpower.
If I could just make one last follow-up on this line,
Yes.
Because you had mentioned that there was an increase in the overall registry of people participating in the Social Security system, though it seems that the gains that did occur in employment did predominantly occur in these newer manufacturing projects such as maquiladora industries, while industries in which organized interests are more concentrated, established industries, parastatal industries, experience declines in employment. So while there may have been some stability in employment, it wasn't, if you disaggregate overall employment, you see important shifts in the structure of employment. And that, I would expect, would have been a somewhat tricky political terrain to cross in terms of reinforcing, once again, the confidence of the social sector, the organized interests in this project. So was there confidence on the part of, again, the trade unions in the expansion of the maquiladora sector? Is my question.
Well, I accept that although we were able to maintain thus the employment situation under some management, we were not able to produce enough employment in the formal sector. So the informal sector augmented very much, and migration from Mexico to the US continued growing. So this is not a satisfactory result. I am just saying that we were able to maintain things in equilibrium without any social explosion that it's natural in these kind of situations.
Let me shift, if I could, shift the focus just a bit to another aspect of your presidency, and that is to issues of foreign policy. It's a vast terrain, but interested in particular in the relationship between Mexico and the United States and how you balance the need to cooperate on many issues. You just mentioned migration, others as well, but with the desire and the need to remain independent of the U.S. in some regards. And perhaps to focus it a bit, maybe we could talk just a moment about a particular issue on which there was some difference of view, and that was the issue of Central America, U.S. policy in Central America, specifically in Nicaragua. And the question is how did you interact with the U.S.? What was the position of Mexico with respect to that issue? What was the nature of relations between Mexico and the United States around those issues in Central America?
Well, undoubtedly, the issue of Central America was the main point of dissidence in our foreign policy. vis-a-vis the American foreign policy. It's good to remember that the overthrow of Mr. Somoza was sponsored by the US government as a sample of some repentance of being quite supportive of the family Somoza for many years. And the family Somoza was one of the most famous examples of Latin American dictatorships. Well, at some time, the US government realized that this cannot persist. And the US government entered into talks with other Central American countries and Venezuela, and even with Mexico, saying that the US government was not willing anymore to support the family Somoza. Times had changed, and they thought that there was time to provoke a change in Nicaragua. Well, although discreetly, Mexico accepted the fact and supported the new Sandinista government. But happens that the Sandinista group began to change their original image of being a democratic movement, and openly they declared that they were Marxists. At this moment, the United States changed their position towards the Sandinistas, and they began to act in such a way to overthrow the Sandinistas by means of supporting the opposition groups to the Sandinistas, even the former partisans of the Somoza's family. And they organized and they supported the so-called Contras in such a way that Mexico could not accept this very crude maneuver. We appreciated at that time that the Sandinistas had the support of their population, of the Nicaraguan public opinion, and we thought that a military intervention from outside would cause a violent situation, not only in Nicaragua but in Central America. So Mexico promoted the formation of an intermediary group with Venezuela, Panama, Colombia, and Mexico, the so-called group Contadora. The group met at the beginning of 83 with the purpose of intermediate between the different parts in Central America, because in Central America everybody was against everybody. And the dialogue was completely interrupted between the Nicaraguans, the Hondurans, the Salvadorians, the Guatemalans. And by means of exercising an unlimited patience from the part of the group, well, we were able to put together in a table, in the same table, representatives from many, from the different countries, from the different Central American countries. Most of the Central American countries distrusted fully to the Nicaraguans. And Venezuela, Colombia, and Mexico tried to establish some common grounds and tried to set the prerequisites for a peaceful arrangement. Well, we acted diplomatically for many months, but our difference with the U.S. government was that the U.S. government thought that there was no remedy for the Sandinistas, that there were just a penetration from the Soviet Union and from the Cubans, and that the only way to solve the problem was to fight the Sandinistas openly and militarily. We didn't agree with this solution. We thought at that time that if a violent solution, a military solution, would be the one supported by the American government, the risk of a generalized war in the area may be present. And well, a generalized war in Central America was quite dangerous for us in the case of Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico. We had already a very important migration from Central America to Mexico, mainly from Guatemala, but also from Salvador, and even from Nicaragua. So we were seeing the result of this turmoil in Central America. So this was why we have a different point of view in relation with the U.S. Fortunately, things evolutionated. Costa Rica played an important role in more in a closer dialogue with the U.S. And then finally the presidents of the Central American countries took their responsibility, and they promoted the movement of Esquipulas with the support of the United Nations Organization and the OAS, and with a discreet presence of of the Grupo Contadora.
Just a very quick follow-on on that. I was curious to what extent this difference of opinion on this matter affected U.S.-Mexican relations, or more particularly, perhaps, your relationship with President Reagan.
Well, fortunately, we were able to separate our differences in matters related with foreign policy than in relation with other matters of our bilateral relationship. In this respect, President Reagan was very mature. He understood our differences in relation with Central America and in other topics of international relations, like different votes in the United Nations. So we split these matters in relation with the very important matters of the economic relationships, the financial relationships, and we were able to overcome these difficulties.
Actually, maybe it's a good time to sort of assess what you accomplished in your presidency, because we began the interview where you were situating us around 1981, 1982 at the start of your presidency in terms of where Mexico was at and the challenges that you saw ahead. If we then put ourselves in 1988 as you leave the presidency, how would you assess now the major accomplishments of that 6-year period and the challenges that you feel you left to the next Mexican president? Where was the country at in 1988 compared to where it was when you began your presidency?
Well, my main satisfaction was to maintain Mexico in social peace within a very difficult circumstance from an economic standpoint. We were able to maintain political stability, social peace, without having to use the army for maintaining peace, through political action mainly. And I think that for a president, this is the greatest satisfaction can attain, to deliver his job in peace, without violence, without civil war. Well, secondly, I think that other important results were the structural changes began and introduced in our economic strategy. The opening of the economy, the revision of the size and extent of the public sector, because they were structural changes that lay the foundations for another stage. I would say that this is my basic balance.
Just to follow up on that, what did you feel was undone? What or not done that you left for Salinas?
Well, I regretted very much the deterioration of social conditions, the insufficient creation of jobs, the insufficient resources for social development, education, health, environment, and so on. I think that this was the black part of the picture.
Do you want to ask?
Well, in terms of the question of the choice, or your choice and the party's choice of a successor, it was significant in that the candidacy of Carlos Salinas was the product of something new within Mexican politics, a pre-candidacy period, which I believe there was not a previous analog or something parallel to it prior to this. I was curious about your shaping of the transfer of power, as well as how the tasks that you felt were left undone would be faced by your successor. Did you choose your successor, Carlos Salinas, with the belief that he would be a person bringing with him tools to adequately confront the challenges that remained? And in what specific ways did he possess those abilities?
Well, I think that Carlos Salinas was selected by the party as its candidate. Because Carlos Salinas was able enough to convince the principal sectors of the PRI, including myself, that he was the best candidate at that time. There is the myth in Mexico that a presidential candidate is just the personal decision of the outgoing presidents. This is a very simplistic explanation. A president cannot invent a presidential candidate, cannot pull the candidate from his lips. The public opinion gradually select a list of possible candidates, and then the public opinion and the different sectors, not only of the party but of the society, discuss the personality of each of them. I don't deny that the outgoing president, in his character of leader of the party, has an important role to play, but not alone. The outgoing president has to be in permanent contact with the principal leaders of the party at the national level and at the local level. We don't have the same system than other countries have. We don't have primaries. We don't have other similar methods of selection. But there is a method of selection, consulting the different forces, the different political forces of parties and of society. The process is usually open. I remember that by the month of June 88, everybody in the newspapers were talking about 6 candidates by name. And a journalist published a book with the biography of these 6 candidates.
And were they in fact real candidates?
In 1988 or 1987?
Yes, excuse me, in 87.
Okay.
In 87. Before the convention of the PRI. Well, at that time, the president of the PRI, Mr. Jorge La Vega, told me that after having consulted the main leaders of the party at the national level and at the local level, he thought that these 6 candidates systematically mentioned by the newspapers, by the political commentators, were in fact the people from the party with possibilities. Well, we agreed at that time that the president of the party say that openly. And the president of the party announced by some day of July that the party considered that there were 6 distinguished members of the PRI who may aspire to the candidacy of the presidency, and that the board, the executive board of the PRI, would invite them to go to the party and present their thinking and their plans. And they were to the party, and each visit of these 6 persons were transmitted by TV and radio with the president of the press. And then the process continued, and at some stage of September, finally, the executive board met with me, and we decided who was going to be the candidate. And the decision was unanimous in favor of Salinas. This was the process at that time. So there is not a closed process, was an open process, different from other countries, of course, but based on consultation within the party and taking into account the opinion of other sectors.
One of the things we've talked about a lot this morning was Mexico entering into a historic trade agreement during your presidency with its entry into the GATT. Recently, Mexico has entered into another historic trade agreement, this North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States and Canada that became effective in 1994. Some people say that that's a step back from free trade because the creation of these regional economies, in a sense, is actually favoring trade within those countries, but discriminating in some ways against trade into that region. Others say this is part of Mexico's natural destiny to be part of a larger regional economy in which it's a part. How do you view Mexico's entry into this North American Free Trade Agreement, and what do you think are the issues the country is going to have to confront in the next few years as this agreement continues to evolve?
Well, I think that the best solution in matters related with trade is a multilateral agreement like GATT. But I accept that realities in our world have been in favor of regional agreements. I consider these regional agreements as a means to walk towards a broader multilateral agreement, as an intermediate step, not as the final solution. I agree that regional agreements may enter into conflict sooner or later, and that this wouldn't be a good solution for the world as a whole. So I am in favor of the NAFTA treaty, but considering it only as an intermediate step towards a multilateral arrangement.
Just to follow on that, and I guess again putting your presidency in the broader historic perspective, to some extent, as you said, you came in at a point where Mexico changed from one strategy and started down another one. Some would argue then that the Salinas administration, consistent with the trajectory that you laid down, followed it, but possibly accelerated it with NAFTA privatizing, or the banks move. The question, I guess, is whether you think that's a fair characterization of the Salinas administration, that is one of continuing and accelerating the changes you began, and whether if you had still been president, you would have moved as swiftly as President Salinas has done in this area.
It's quite difficult to answer because decisions taken by those who are in power are determined by circumstances. Generally speaking, I am a gradualist. I prefer step by step and not running excessively. Probably some advances that undoubtedly President Salinas made were so audacious that he provoked the reaction of some factors of society. These aspects are now being discussed in Mexico. Some people think that maybe some marginal revision of NAFTA may be advisable. Some people think that the government must be more gradual in some privatizations, like the petrochemical plants. There is a discussion of rhythm, not of philosophy right now. I think that in this respect the country has gained. We are not discussing anymore the basic points or the basic lines of the strategy, but just a question of speed, of rhythm, of extent. And well, I think that this is natural and should be open to discussion. I prefer to advance within a vast consensus instead of forcing advancements with conflicts behind.
And I was just saying, in line with these kinds of developments, I mean, one other big development that seems to have been occurring in recent years is a greater degree of political pluralization within Mexico as different parties seem to be gaining in strength. Do you feel that's a process that will continue to gain in importance and in strength as the country continues into the next 5 or 10 years?
Yes, I think so. The Mexican society during the last decades has evolutionated towards diversity. Development implies diversity, and diversity in the social and economic aspects induces political pluralism. So I think that political pluralism is unavoidable. We have advanced very much in this direction. I think that there is no reverse in this trend, and we are going to be accustomed to a new political game.
Scott, do you have anything before we finish up?
Well, perhaps along the lines of the question of pluralism, there's the issue of attempts during your administration to implement some political reforms in the way in which elections are conducted and in the way in which results are evaluated. And the common story in the social science literature is that this was attempted, that it met with resistance from various sectors that were affiliated with the PRI, and that it was found necessary to be able to take a step back and postpone some of those transformations. Would you care to comment on that traditional story of how political reform may not be a smooth linear process in the case of Mexico?
I think that big changes must be by necessity gradual. If you want to get efficient changes, you may push changes, and they may be quicker. But sometimes if you push excessively, the advancement is weak. I always have preferred to proceed step by step, but firmly. And this has been the case of the recent political evolution of Mexico. Of course, there are many people, respectable people, who would like a more rapid political reform. I think that you have to be very prudent in introducing political changes for the sake of getting firm advancements. We Mexicans have been very keen of political stability in Mexico. We have the record not only of Latin America, but of Europe. We haven't had civil wars like Europe. We haven't participated in regional wars like in Europe, who is the paradigm of a civilized continent. Well, I think that we have to preserve this tradition of stability, of continuity, even though we don't make spectacular advancements. I prefer efficiency instead of spectacularity.
I think we have time for just one short question. I just wanted to ask you briefly, looking to the future now, Mexico enters the 21st century. What do you see as the biggest challenge for Mexico and for future leaders of Mexico in the foreseeable future, in the next 20 years, the first part of the 21st century?
Well, I foresee the need of continuing limiting population growth. We have been advancing in this direction, but we have to be very, very alert to limit population growth. Other way, the solution of other problems may be impossible. Well, as a whole, the most serious problem in Mexico is social inequality. So we have to put our efforts, our major efforts towards diminishing social inequality. And I think that there are two ways to work efficiently in this respect. Economic recovery in order to provide employment, and better education. This would be my sum.
Great. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and we really appreciate the frankness with which you've addressed these issues and also how stimulating your insights have been. So thank you very, very much, and I thank my panelists as well. Thank you, President de la Madrid.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.